Okay, good morning, students. Welcome in. Make sure you grabbed your notes from the front. They should be laid out there. Make sure you have your notebook and a highlighter and a pencil. So today we are going to talk about evolution. About 2 weeks ago, we were talking about natural selection, which is like the precursor to evolution. So natural selection is surviving from one generation to the next. Today we're going to talk about what's the evidence of evolution? What evidences do we have in the sciences? So the purpose of today is that I can explain the evidence of common ancestry using fossils, biogeography, similarities in anatomy, DNA, and development by analyzing real-world scenarios. So remember your investigation from Wednesday last week. In that investigation, you determined that whales had actually evolved from land mammals, not from sharks or sea animals. And how did we know that? Well, in that lab that you guys did on Wednesday, you guys looked at comparative anatomy. So what that means is that you compared the actual anatomy, the bone structure of whales, sharks, and dog-like creatures. You looked at fossils. So you looked at how the fossils could have been ordered in a way that makes sense of the evolution that we were looking at. And you looked at DNA similarities. So the more similar something is, the more DNA it has in common. So these are the three main ones we're going to talk about today. When it comes to fossil record, we were looking at how these fossils, like the Rhodiocetus, evolved. So a fossil is a preserved remain of dead organisms. When things die, sometimes their bones get preserved due to the calcium in the soil. So we can use these fossil records to gain information about when organisms lived and what their environment was like. Because a lot of times the fossils are stuck in specific spots of the rock. That tells us the age of the fossil, and that can also tell us what was around that fossil. So imagine we find a seashell fossil in the top of a mountain. What does that tell us about the environment? So what you should be seeing here is the fact that the only way a seashell fossil could make it to the top of a mountain is if at one point that mountain used to be underwater. So that tells us at one point this environment used to be underwater. It used to be aquatic. Now, how would this transformation even occur? So here we have this fly-like creature, and we know that this was the ancestor of what we consider a dragonfly nowadays. So how did it happen? How would something that looks like this become something like the dragonfly? Well, the oldest fossil looks very much like a fly. Maybe at one point its body became longer, its wings became a little bit bigger, and then its body got a little bit smaller, its wings kept getting larger, its arms maybe got forward. Slowly, we saw that movement in the eyes and the head. And by the end, after a really long time, these are the transition fossils. They show us the transition between point A to point B. We get what we know as today is our dragonfly. So at the beginning, we had something totally different. The transition fossils tell us the story, and by the end, we get what we were looking for. So when the environment is stable, this change occurs slowly. So when we're in a stable environment where everything's good, this change is constantly happening but slow. You're going to see these slow transition fossils. So when you see this slow change, it's called gradualism. So you see the gradual change of fossils over time. Now, how does evolution occur? Evolution means change. It's a change over time. So usually you'll see it in graphs like this. Evolution is change over time. So the first type is gradualism. The first type of evolution is gradualism. It's a slow and steady change over time. So it would look something like this if we were to graph it out. We had at the beginning our fly-like creature. Slowly it changes. Its body changes, its leg changes, its head changes, it gets more wings, and finally, by the end, we get our dragonfly. These small, consistent changes led to a huge change, which is what we call evolution. And that's what we call gradualism specifically. Now, there's a different type of evolution. Here's another example. I have this shell-like creature. It dies, it becomes its fossil, but suddenly I have a sloth-like creature, a giant sloth. The shell and the sloth are very different from each other. Now, this evolution could look something like this. Maybe at the beginning I had this shell-like creature, and the shell-like creature survived. So whenever you see these lines going parallel like that, with the bottom, that means it stays the same. Now, whenever you see the line go down, that means it changed. So our shell-like creature survived, it stayed the same, but something happened, and the mammoth came out of it. And then the mammoth survived, it stayed the same, but something happened, and the saber-toothed tiger came out of it. So when you see that straight line, that means no change. So when there's a straight line, there's no change. So there's no change here, there's no change here. But when you see the line going down, that means change. So whenever you see a straight line, that means a period of stable environment. So when the line was straight, this was a stable environment, everything was good. But then when you see that sudden angled line, that means there's a rapid change. So maybe in between this creature and the mammoth, there was an ice age, and that caused the mammoth to appear. And then maybe between the mammoth and the saber-toothed tiger, there was a volcano. That was a rapid change, and that caused the saber-toothed tiger to appear. And maybe between the saber-toothed tiger and the giant sloth, there was a tornado, and that was a rapid change that caused the sloth to appear. So whenever you see those angled arrows, that means there was a rapid change, usually a volcano, a hurricane, a meteor, lots of those catastrophic events. So whenever you see these type of lines, that's called punctuated equilibrium. So what that means is we're punctuating our equilibrium. Equilibrium means there's no change. Punctuated means we're seeing a change. So punctuated equilibrium is usually shown with fast change followed by stasis, so no change. So it's fast, slow, fast, slow, fast, slow. So you're going to see in the graph right now, we start with our little shell. It goes fast because there's a rapid change. That was the ice age in our example. Then the mammoth comes along. It stays the same for a very long time. That mammoth is alive for thousands of years. That's our stasis. Then we have a rapid change. There's a volcano. The mammoth dies. Our saber-toothed tiger comes along. That saber-toothed tiger lives for thousands of years. It lives in its perfect environment. Suddenly, there's a tornado. It kills all of our saber-toothed tigers. That's a rapid change. And then our great sloth comes around. It lives again in stasis, in stable change. So punctuated equilibrium, you see that graph going up, straight, up, straight. So if we connect both types of evolution, we have gradualism. It's consistent, it's slow, but it's constantly moving, constantly going up. And then we have punctuated equilibrium. It's fast, slow, fast, slow, fast, slow. At the end, they both get to the same point. They're both getting to evolution. But what evidence do we even have to support the difference between gradualism and punctuated? Well, we were just talking about fossils. Fossils show us how things changed over time. And we can look at fossils and see if it's punctuated or if it's gradualism. So with gradualism, you'll see fossils like on the left-hand side, where we have fossils in every layer, and you can see the change happen slowly. At the beginning, we had these plain, like pentagon fossils. After one generation, well, it's not one generation, after one layer, we see the pentagon fossils now with some lines on them. After another layer, we see those same fossils now with some little legs. And by the end, we see the fossils with the legs, the lines, and the dot in the middle. On the other hand, punctuated would be straightforward. You're going to see the change very quickly. So we have one layer with our fossils that are plain, and suddenly they grow legs, they have the lines on them, they have a little spot on them. They're a totally different creature, they're a totally different fossil. That would be punctuated equilibrium. So gradualism, we see that slow change in the fossil. That'd be the left-hand side. We see a slow change. Punctuated, we see a quick change between our two layers. So this is your notes. So your paper, fold it in half. You should see this in your notebook. It should be, you have one on top of the other. We're going to fill this out. You're going to need a pencil and a highlighter. So our first type is going to be gradualism. I want you guys to write gradualism. So gradualism, we see this constant change, this consistent line changing. This happens when there's a stable environment. So when you have a stable environment where our environment was good for that creature, that is where gradualism happens. These changes occur slowly and gradually. That's where gradual comes from. Over a long period of time. We can observe these changes through these things called transition fossils. The transition fossils show us the steps. So think about the whales, think about the example with the dragonfly. We see the steps slowly changing. That's gradualism. Now, our other type of evolution was punctuated equilibrium. So your other one, you're going to put punctuated equilibrium. With punctuated equilibrium, you're going to see this motion of stop, start, stop, start, stop, start. So this happens when there's periods of stasis or stability. You're going to see these straight lines, these parallel lines. And when there's periods of rapid, unstable environment, you're going to see these lines going up rapidly. So we have our stasis and our unstable environments. They're constantly changing. That's what punctuated equilibrium happens. So this is shown with a period of stasis, or a stable environment, interrupted by fast periods of rapid change. So we had stasis and stable environment, and then a volcano, or a hurricane, or a tornado, and it caused some kind of rapid change that caused our organisms to change incredibly quickly. So this caused an increase in biodiversity. That's the important thing about punctuated equilibrium. We're always increasing biodiversity with our punctuated equilibrium. So think about it like this. When there was a meteor and all the dinosaurs died, yes, that killed all the dinosaurs, but that's what led to the increase of biodiversity that we know of today. It led to mammals, it led to birds, it led to fishes, it led to amphibians. All of these different organisms only could happen because the dinosaurs died. So increased biodiversity happens when we have these unstable environments. So make sure you guys have these front section of your notes. Now we're going to get to the inside part of our notes. So there are some evidences of evolution, and you need to know how to read them. The first one is comparative anatomy. We did a little bit of this in the whale lab. So here we have the forelimbs of a bunch of different animals. The forelimbs is the front limbs. So it'd be our human arm, the front limbs of a horse, the front limb of a cat, a bat, a bird, and a whale. What do we notice they all have in common? If you guys notice from the coloring, they have the same structure. They have the same bones. We might not notice it, but if you look at a human arm and a cat arm, we have almost exactly the same bones in the same order. Even a bat arm has the same bones in the same order. They just use it for flying instead. Same with a bird, same with a horse. They have exactly the same bones, they're just used for different things. So do these organisms all use these bones in different ways? No, they all have different functions. We use our arms for grabbing, horses use theirs for running, bats use theirs for flying, whales use theirs for swimming, but they're all the same. So when you see this structure of same bones, different functions, this shows us we have a common ancestor. You're going to hear this word common ancestor a lot through the topic of evolution. Common ancestor means that we all come from somewhere. So us and cats and birds and bats and whales, we all were the same organism at some point, millions of years ago. We were all the same animal. We call these structures homologous structures. You guys know the prefix homo from genetics. Homo means same. So a homologous structure is the same structure but different function. So our hand bones are the same as a whale fin because they have the same bones but they have a different function. This proves to us that there were common ancestors. The organism where everything came from, our shared relative. We all evolved from something. So in this example, it might be the Pakicetus that we were looking at in the whale lab. So if we remember about the whale lab, we had our Pakicetus, our Rhodocetus, and our Balænoptera. What is different from these? You guys should notice the Balænoptera doesn't have legs. The Pakicetus and the Rhodocetus do. So the Pakicetus and the Rhodocetus have legs. The Balænoptera does not. But if we look really closely to the Balænoptera, which is the normal whale, right? If you zoom in onto where the legs should have been, you see this little bone. This little bone is actually the pelvic bone. So it's actually where your legs connect to, your pelvis. But the whale doesn't have legs. Why would it need a pelvic bone? Well, this is left over from when they had legs. So whales used to have legs, and they still have a pelvic bone. This shows us that their common ancestor used to walk on land. This shows us they used to need to have legs. They used to be Apacocetus. So we call this the vestigial structure. So for people who speak Spanish, vestigial, it comes from the word viejo, to be old, right? So a vestigial structure is an old structure, something that no longer has a need. So I like to think about this like, imagine, the things that you have packed in your attic or at the back of your closet that you don't really need anymore, but you don't throw it away just in case. It's the same concept. The whale doesn't need the pelvic bone. It doesn't have legs, but it keeps it just in case, right? Like as a memory. So our example is leg bones for this. So we use vestigial structures to show us what an organisms used to be. So there's a lot of examples of this. If you touch your back, right where your spine ends, you can kind of feel a bump. That's called your tailbone. So back when humans had tails, when we were part of the monkey species, or when we were part of something further back that had tails, our tails would connect to this little bump. But we no longer have tails, but we still have the tailbone. We have this vestigial structure. Another example is wings on flightless birds. Penguins have wings, and ostriches have wings, but they can't fly. They came from an organism, a bird that could fly. They no longer need those wings, but they still have them, just in case. It's a vestigial structure. So this is the inside section of our notes. At the top, I want you guys to write comparative anatomy. Anytime you are comparing the anatomy of two organisms, we're talking about comparative anatomy. The first type of comparative anatomy are our homologous structures. Remember, the purpose of comparative anatomy is always to find your common ancestor. Your common ancestor is what we all came from. That's the purpose of evolution. So you're going to hear this word common ancestor a lot. The first one is homologous structure. Think about our arm bones. We share the same bones with cats, with whales, with bats. Homologous, homo means same, so homologous means they have the same structure but different function. So I want you guys to make sure you highlight that. So they have the same structure, different function. Our second one is our vestigial structure. Remember, for your Spanish speakers, vestigial comes from the word viejo. It's old. So a vestigial structure is something the organism doesn't need anymore. It's something it used to need, but it doesn't need it anymore. So think about the pelvic bone in whales. It no longer has legs, but it still has a pelvis. Think about our tailbone. We no longer have tails, but we still have a tailbone. This is a vestigial structure. There's a few of these. You can think about our appendix as well. You could think about our wisdom teeth. These are all things we no longer need. Make sure you guys have your notes, and we'll move on to the next section. If you need more time to do this, please just pause. So, what else can we compare? There's more things to compare. So we compared bones, we compared anatomy. There's one more thing that we can compare. We can compare our DNA. So remember, DNA shows us what we are, and the more DNA you have in common with somebody, the more connected you are. So we call this biochemical similarities. When I say biochemical similarities, I just mean DNA. It's just a fancier, correct way of saying it. So if I ask you who is more related to the whale, the hippo, the rhino, or the giraffe, and I give you the whale's amino acid sequence, you should be able to figure it out. If you want, you can pause now and try it for yourself. If not, I'll walk you guys through it. So the way you would do this, you remember, the more DNA you have in common, the closer related you are to somebody. So I know the whale has the amino acid sequence GLU, ALA, VAL, LYS. So let's look at the other ones. I see that the hippo has GLU, VAL, and LYS in the same spot as the whale. It is important that it's in the same spot. It cannot be randomized or mixed. The rhino has ALA and VAL, but it doesn't have the GLU or the LYS. And the giraffe only has the LYS. So what I would do then is I would count how many I see that are the same. So hippo has 3, rhino has 2, giraffe has 1. The one that has the highest number is going to be the one that has the most in common to my whale. So I see the hippo is the one that has the highest number. So the hippo is the most related to my whale. So the more DNA in common, the more related. This makes sense, right? You have more DNA in common with your parents. You're more related to your parents than you are to Beyonce. We might all be humans, but your DNA, you have half of your DNA from your dad, half of your DNA from your mom. So you have more DNA in common to your parents. You're more related to your parents. So your notes, we're going to go to this section that looks like this. I want you guys to write biochemical similarities. So biochemical similarities is the DNA that we have in common. These are similarities in our nitrogen bases or amino acids, and the more similar we are, the more recent our common ancestor is. So a lot of time when you guys get to your test on Friday or your quiz on Wednesday, you will see these graphs that look like this where I give you sequences. I will just ask you to look for which ones are the most similar. The more similar they are, the more related they are. Make sure you guys have highlighted more recent common ancestors. If you need more time on this section, take your time, but I'm going to move on to the next section. There is one last thing that we did not talk about too much when it came to the whale lab. So, on the left-hand side, we have a human embryo. That means the baby when it's still in the belly. On the left-hand side, we have a chicken embryo. So if you guys notice, at the beginning of the video, the chicken embryo and the human embryo look very, very similar. But after a few days, the human embryo tends to get a bigger head, the chicken embryo gets that really big eye, and that's where we start seeing that separation, where you can clearly tell it's a chicken and a human. But let's look at those embryos again. This is a bunch of different species of animals. If we look at those embryos right when they start, they look really, really similar. You can barely tell there's a difference amongst them. Now, how many groups of species do you think you see here? Pause, think, how many groups of species do you think there are? Okay, so let's move on to a few weeks from that point. A few weeks later, the embryos look like this. Now, how many groups of species do you think you see here? What about now? How many groups do you see? Pause, think. I personally think I see like maybe 3, maybe 4 groups. Let's keep going until the end. So at the end, we should notice these are all actually different animals. We should notice the first one's a fish, the second one's a salamander, the third one's a tortoise, a chicken, a pig, a cow, a rabbit, and a human. All of those animals, when they're, real animals, they look totally different from each other. But when they were embryos, they looked really similar. So some organisms look more similar for longer periods of time than others. This tells us more information about their common ancestry. The more similar they look for the longer period of time, the more closely related they are. So if you guys notice, the fish and the salamander looked really similar all the way up to the end. That shows us they're really closely related. And the cow and the rabbit look really similar. That shows that they're really closely related, as well as the tortoise and the chicken. So this shows us these groups, this shows us how related those embryos are. So embryology is the study of the embryo or the baby development. So embryo means the baby development. So embryology is the study of the baby. Here we have a little example. Here we have our fish when it's fully grown. We have turtle, chicken, and human. But if you notice at the beginning, they all look the same. The fish changes very quickly, while the turtle, chicken, and human stay pretty similar. So the more similar the organism are at the early stages of development, the more related they are. So the more they stay in common, the more related. So is the chicken more closely related to a turtle or to a human? So let's look at the chicken. We should see it looks exactly the same as the turtle and the human at the beginning, but in the second stage, we should see it has like 3 to 4 bumps on its head. The turtle has the same amount of bumps, more or less. The human only has 2, right? The human also has this weird chest puff, while the turtle and the chicken don't have it at the second stage. This means that the chicken looks a lot more similar to the turtle for a longer period of time. That shows me that the chicken is closer related to the turtle. It has that weird big eye like the turtle. It has the same back shape like the turtle. It's got the tail like the turtle, maybe a little bit shorter, but it's still there. On the other hand, the human has a different head shape, doesn't have the tail anymore. Its back isn't as curved. So this shows us that the chicken is closer related to the turtle than to the human. That's how you would do an embryology question. So in our notes, I want you guys to write embryology for this section. So you're writing embryology. You are going to highlight organisms that look similar during early development, share a recent common ancestor. Remember, the word common ancestor is kind of our key word throughout evolution. We're always looking for what we have in common. What was our common ancestor? So our example here is our chicken and our turtle. They are more related to each other than to the fish or the human because they look more similar throughout those steps. So look at that image. Our chicken and our turtle are those two middle ones. They look a lot more similar to each other than to the fish, which is the left-hand one, or to the human, which is the right-hand one. Sorry, guys. Allergies. Okay. There's one last one we did not talk about too much, but you do need to know. It is called biogeography. So bio stands for biology. Geography stands for geography. So biogeography stands for the study of the geographical, like where they live, of these organisms. So what happens is similar species across multiple continents tend to indicate common ancestry. So there's the ostrich or the nyandu in South America. There's the rhea in Africa. There's the emu in Australia. All of these are large flightless birds that mainly use their legs to attack. This shows us that they might have been connected at some point by some animal that was able to get to all of these different continents. So, how do we know whales evolved from land mammals? Let's go back to that lab that we talked about on Wednesday. We have the vestigial structure, their pelvic bone. They have a pelvis they no longer need. That's their vestigial structure. That shows us they used to have legs. We have the homologous structure. That's their fins. We notice that their fins have the exact same bones as our arm bones. That showed us that they probably had similar arm bones to us that they used to walk before. We have the fossils. The fossils have similar skull shape across all these fossils, showing us they're connected and they evolved via gradualism because we see they gradually changed. And we have this similar DNA sequence. They have a lot more DNA in common with hippos or land mammals than they do with sharks or fish. So we have all of this evidence that shows us that whales evolved from land mammals, that they had a common ancestor with us. They provide evidence of a common ancestor. So now you are done with your notes. I want you guys to glue these into your notebook. Ask Coach La Rosa or the sub for some glue sticks if you cannot find them. Then you're going to complete the rest of this formative by yourself. Use these notes. This formative is for a grade. You have your quiz on Wednesday, just as a reminder, about evolution. And then you have a test on evolution and natural selection on Friday. I will be back tomorrow so we can finish these notes. But please use your notes to help you out on this formative. You do get 2 tries. So good luck, guys. Email me if there are any issues with this formative.